On November 15, 2023, in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, USA, during a quiet evening, Officer Jim Barnes was patrolling his usual route on Main Street when he noticed an older man cycling without a front light or reflector. Known for his dedication to ensuring traffic safety, Jim decided to stop and remind the man, "Excuse me, sir, you need a front light and a reflector to ride on the road," Officer Jim Barnes called out, his voice firm but measured. With one hand resting on his belt and the other gesturing for the cyclist to stop, Jim radiated the no-nonsense authority of a seasoned patrolman who had dealt with countless late-night road safety violations. The cyclist, a man with a scruffy beard and clothes that looked like they hadn't seen a washing machine in weeks, pulled over. Dust clung to his worn jacket, and the faint smell of damp leaves hung in the air around him. Despite his disheveled appearance, he tilted his head and offered a warm, almost disarming smile. "Ah, sorry about that, officer," he said, his voice low but surprisingly steady, almost as if he'd rehearsed this line before. "My name's Gregory Stallings," he spoke with an air of confidence that seemed slightly out of place, given the circumstances. Jim raised an eyebrow. Something about the man's demeanor didn't quite match his appearance. Most people in his position caught breaking a minor law tended to fumble nervously or make excuses. But this man, he seemed oddly calm, as though he had nothing to hide or perhaps too much to reveal. "Gregory Stallings, huh?" Jim repeated, jotting the name down in his notebook. His instincts, honed by years on the force, whispered that this encounter might be more than just another routine stop. Little did Officer Jim Barnes know that what appeared to be a routine stop would unravel into one of the most shocking arrests of his career, exposing a fugitive who had successfully evaded capture for 3 decades. Jim Barnes wasn't just an officer, he was a man on a mission. Known affectionately and occasionally mockingly around the precinct as Reflector Jim, he had earned a reputation for his unwavering commitment to enforcing even the most minor safety regulations. For Jim, every small rule was a building block of a safer community. And bike safety, that was his domain. It wasn't just about reflectors or lights. It was about protecting lives no matter how small the infraction might seem. So, when his sharp eyes caught sight of a scruffy, unkempt man pedaling down Main Street without so much as a reflector glinting in the fading evening light, Jim's instincts surged. His police cruiser made a smooth U-turn, lights flashing faintly to signal the man to pull over. "Excuse me, sir," Jim called out as he stepped out of his car, already reaching for his citation pad. "You're riding without a rear reflector or a front light. That's a big safety risk not just for you but for everyone else on the road." The cyclist slowed down, his patch jacket flapping in the cool breeze. His face was weathered, framed by a scraggly beard that seemed to hide decades of untold stories. "Oh, sorry, officer," the man mumbled, his voice a peculiar blend of confidence and caution. "Name's Gregory Stallings." He fumbled in his pocket, pulling out a crumpled piece of paper that looked more like an old takeout menu than any form of identification. Jim's experienced eyes scanned the man skeptically. There was something about his demeanor, a mix of charm and defensiveness, that made Jim's gut stir. "Gregory Stallings, huh?" he asked, arching an eyebrow. "Well, let's get this sorted. You got a proper ID on you?" The man hesitated, scratching his head as if searching for an answer buried in the fog of his memory. Not on me, officer. I had an accident years ago. My memory's a little fuzzy. Makes it hard to keep track of things like I dis." Jim, ever diligent, entered the information into his onboard system. But the more he searched, the stranger it became. No matches, no records. It was as if this Gregory Stallings didn't exist at all. A small infraction had suddenly taken on an air of mystery, and Jim's instincts told him this was more than just a simple case of missing reflectors. What began as a mundane stop would soon spiral into an investigation that would uncover a chilling truth. Unbeknownst to Jim, the man standing before him wasn't a harmless drifter. He was a ghost from the past, a fugitive who had vanished without a trace and managed to stay off the radar for 30 long years. With the precision of a hawk locking onto its prey, Officer Jim Barnes steered his patrol car to the curb and stepped out, his boots crunching purposefully against the gravel-strewn roadside. The target of his attention, a scruffy, middle-aged man wobbling along on a battered old bicycle that seemed to defy the laws of physics by staying upright. "Excuse me, sir," Jim barked, his voice a firm blend of authority and exasperation, honed over years of dealing with safety infractions both mundane and bizarre. His tone was sharp enough to cut through the quiet hum of crickets in the cool evening air. The man froze mid-pedal, his weathered face illuminated by the flashing red and blue lights of Jim's cruiser. "Yes, officer," he replied, looking as guilty as a dog caught raiding the kitchen trash. "You're riding without a reflector and no front light either," Jim continued, the words punctuated by a quick gesture toward the dim, reflector-less rear of the bike. "That's a safety hazard." Jim squared his shoulders, adjusting his posture with the unconscious pride of a man who had stopped more bicycles and cars in his career. His chest puffed out slightly, a reflex born from countless roadside lectures delivered to errant cyclists. This wasn't just about rules. For Jim, it was a personal crusade for safety. The bicyclist shifted uncomfortably, his hands gripping the handlebars as if they might shield him from the officer's scrutiny. His silence was filled with the soft creak of his bike's ancient frame. "I'm here to protect people, not write tickets," Jim added, though his tone left little room for debate. His eyes, sharp and unrelenting, took in every detail: the patched jeans, the mud-caked shoes, the frayed edge of a jacket that looked like it had weathered more storms than Jim himself. It wasn't just the lack of reflectors or the missing front light that caught Jim's attention. It was something deeper, an unease he couldn't quite place, but one he'd learned not to ignore. The cyclist, a wiry figure with a beard that could have housed a small bird, skidded to a halt and looked up, blinking in surprise. "Ah, sorry, officer," he mumbled, reaching into his pocket. "The name's Gregory Stallings." He fished out what he seemed to think was identification and handed over a crumpled piece of paper that Jim quickly realized was a takeout menu. The specials for shrimp scampi and eggplant parmesan stared back at him mockingly. Jim's brow furrowed, his cop instincts tingling. "Mr. Stallings," he said slowly, examining the man as if he were a particularly tricky crossword clue, "you don't happen to have anything official on you, do you? Like, say, an ID card that isn't laminated in marinara sauce?" Gregory shrugged, offering a sheepish grin that revealed teeth of various shades. "Ah, well, you see, I bumped my head a while back. Memory's a little fuzzy, you know." He tapped his temple for effect, as if that would clear things up. Jim wasn't buying it. He ran the name through the system, only to come up empty. No hits. No record. Nothing. "Strange," Jim muttered, eyeing the man with mounting suspicion. "Are you sure you exist, Mr. Stallings?" The cyclist chuckled nervously, scratching his chin. "Sometimes I wonder about that myself." Jim didn't laugh. He leaned on his patrol car, his frown deepening. Something about this disheveled stranger didn't add up. A man without an ID, without a record, without even a basic understanding of why bike safety mattered. This wasn't just a routine stop anymore, it was the beginning of a puzzle, one Jim was determined to solve. Jim's instincts, honed from years of patrolling the streets, kicked into high gear, a bike-riding amnesiac with no ID. Something's definitely off here, he thought, narrowing his eyes at the disheveled man. Gregory's story was as flimsy as the excuse he'd just given for his lack of documentation. "Let's try this again," Jim said, his voice steady but firm. "Where have you lived before?" Gregory scratched his head, eyes darting as if chasing memories that didn't exist. Let's see, Florida. Maybe Alaska. Oh, and there was that one time in Atlantis." Jim blinked, his skepticism now fully blossomed. "Atlantis, really?" he muttered under his breath. He had dealt with his fair share of dubious characters, but a supposed Atlantean fugitive was a first. "Okay, Mr. Stallings," Jim said, the name rolling off his tongue with all the enthusiasm of someone reading a bad punchline. He began tapping his tablet, logging the bizarre exchange into the system. "Why don't you hang tight here while I call in some experts?" Behind the professionalism, Jim's mind was racing. Was this man delusional, or was he playing a clever game to hide something? The mention of multiple far-flung states, and even a mythical underwater city, was clearly an attempt to throw him off. But Jim had been on the force long enough to know that where there's smoke, there's fire. He glanced at Gregory again, noting the nervous fidgeting, the darting eyes, and the too-easy grin. This wasn't just a quirky cyclist with a reflector problem, this was a man hiding something big. Jim couldn't wait to peel back the layers of this mystery, one fabricated address at a time. To the local community, Gregory Stallings was more than just a familiar face, he was practically a fixture. Known affectionately as Uncle G, he had an uncanny ability to charm both young and old with his easygoing demeanor and his knack for storytelling. At the local community center, where he volunteered regularly, Gregory was admired for his ability to teach survival skills, crafting shelters out of leaves, starting fires with sticks, and even identifying edible plants. These practical lessons earned him the trust and admiration of the town's youth. "He's harmless," one teen recounted, her voice tinged with disbelief after the truth was revealed. "We never imagined he was, like, Dad bad. He just taught us how to survive in the woods, he made it fun." This image of a friendly, scruffy mentor now felt chilling in hindsight. Gregory's presence in the community seemed so unthreatening that parents had no qualms about letting their children join his informal nature lessons. Often, he would lead small groups of kids into the nearby woods, spinning tales about the old days and teaching them how to navigate the wild. Local residents were shocked to learn that the man they thought was just a quirky, down-on-his-luck drifter was actually a fugitive with a sinister past. Many felt a deep sense of betrayal, especially the families whose children had interacted with him. "It's horrifying to think about now," said one parent. "He had all our trust. We let our kids go into the woods with him, and he turned out to be a predator in disguise." The revelation of his true identity left the town grappling with unease, forcing them to question how someone with such a dark past could have embedded himself so seamlessly into their lives. It also sparked a community-wide reckoning about the dangers of appearances and the unsettling reality of how easily trust can be misplaced. Officer Jim Barnes, ever the diligent investigator, decided to dig deeper into the enigma sitting before him. The man's story wasn't adding up, and the name Gregory Stallings seemed as fake as the paper ID he had presented. Determined to uncover the truth, Jim sent the man's photo through a facial recognition database. A loud ping soon confirmed his suspicions. The name Gregory Stallings wasn't just fabricated. It was stolen from someone who had been dead since the early 2000s. The realization hit like a thunderclap in Jim's mind. He turned to face the man, his expression a mix of incredulity and sharp suspicion. "So, you're dead," Jim quipped, his voice tinged with dry humor. The man leaned back, a faint smirk curling on his lips. "Technically. But I'm a very lively corpse," he replied, spreading his hands theatrically as if performing for an invisible audience. Jim's brow furrowed, his patience wearing thin. "Well, Mr. Deadman Walking, care to explain how you've managed to defy the laws of mortality and the DMV for so long?" The man shrugged nonchalantly, his eyes darting around as if searching for a lifeline. "I don't know, officer. Maybe it's just clean living," he said, though the faint scent of tobacco and stale sweat suggested otherwise. Jim wasn't buying the act. "Listen, buddy, pretending to be someone who doesn't exist is one thing, but claiming the identity of a literal ghost, that's next-level suspicious," he said, crossing his arms. The atmosphere in the small town suddenly felt heavier. A simple stop for a missing reflector had morphed into the unraveling of a decades-old mystery. Jim's instincts told him he had stumbled onto something big, something that couldn't be explained away with a wink and a smile. As the investigation deepened, the truth unraveled like a plot twist in a crime novel. The scruffy cyclist wasn't Gregory Stallings at all. He was George Hartlerow, a fugitive whose name had been etched into the dusty annals of unsolved cases. Wanted since 1983 for kidnapping and sexual assault, George had managed to elude law enforcement for 3 decades, moving from place to place, leaving nothing but faint whispers of his existence. "You've been on the run for 30 years?" Officer Jim Barnes asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. George shrugged nonchalantly, leaning back against the patrol car. Time flies when you're biking." His smirk carried an unsettling mix of arrogance and apathy, as though his crimes were just a minor detour in the grand tour of his life. Jim stared at him, momentarily speechless. This wasn't the usual petty offender trying to wiggle out of a fine. This man had walked away from justice, disappearing into a haze of stolen identities and fabricated stories, leaving a trail colder than a Midwestern winter. What astonished Jim more was the ease with which George had blended into society. "You really thought no one would catch up to you?" Jim finally asked, his tone now sharper. George chuckled, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Officer, I've been everywhere: Florida, Ohio, Iowa. I've lived in tents, shelters, and backwoods. Heck, I even volunteered at community centers. If blending in was an Olympic sport, I'd had the gold. The sheer audacity left Jim fuming but oddly impressed. George's escape wasn't just about staying hidden. It was about becoming invisible in plain sight. But the smirk faded from George's face as Jim pulled out the final piece of evidence, a photo comparison confirming his identity. "End of the road, George," Jim said, his voice heavy with a mix of triumph and gravity. George sighed, as if the weight of his own lies had finally caught up with him. For 30 years, he had outrun his past, but under the cold scrutiny of justice, there was no escaping now. George Hartle Road, now exposed as a fugitive, seemed unfazed as Officer Jim Barnes informed him of his arrest. His demeanor was alarmingly casual for a man about to face justice after 3 decades on the run. "I can't believe I almost let you go," Jim muttered, shaking his head in disbelief as he snapped the handcuffs into place. George smirked, his tone dripping with irony. "Hey, I didn't even try to run. That's growth, right?" he quipped, as though they were old friends reminiscing about past mischief rather than captor and criminal. The remark didn't sit well with Jim. 30 years, George. 30 years you've been out there, pretending to be someone else, living your life while your victims lived with the scars you left. Growth. Jim's voice sharpened, his words laced with frustration. "This is justice finally catching up." George shrugged nonchalantly, his smirk still intact. "Well, everyone's gotta get caught sometime. Guess today's my day," he replied, his lack of remorse chilling. As Jim guided him to the police cruiser, the weight of the moment wasn't lost on the officer. He thought about the victims, the families who had waited years for answers. While George might have been able to joke about his arrest, for Jim and the community, this was no laughing matter. Behind the dry humor and false bravado, Jim sensed something deeper, a man who had run for so long that getting caught might almost feel like a relief. The relief or not, George Hartle Road was heading back to face the consequences of his actions, no matter how much he tried to deflect with wit and sarcasm. The revelation that Gregory Stallings, or rather, George Hartle Road, had been living under an assumed identity for decades sent shockwaves through the tight-knit community of Cedar Rapids. For years, he had been a familiar, if somewhat peculiar, presence around town, particularly among the local teenagers. Many had seen him as a friendly, somewhat eccentric figure who would often wander through the woods, offering advice and companionship to the young people who frequented the area. But with the sudden discovery of his true identity, everything about Uncle G took on a dark, disturbing twist. Teens who had hung out with him for years suddenly found themselves grappling with the terrifying realization that they had unknowingly shared campfires, s'mores, and even life lessons with a fugitive wanted for heinous crimes. One local girl, still in shock, recalled how Uncle G had taught her how to build a proper campfire, showing her how to survive in the woods. "I thought he was teaching us how to stay safe in the woods," she said, her voice trembling. "Turns out he was teaching himself how to hide better." The community, in its collective disbelief, began to piece together the unsettling history of George Hartle Road. For so long, he had presented himself as just another quirky, harmless older man who lived off the grid, someone who had perhaps seen too much of the world and chosen to withdraw into the seclusion of the woods. But behind his gentle demeanor was a man who had committed violent crimes, escaped custody, and eluded capture for over 30 years. The psychological impact on the local youth was profound. Many of them had confided in him, shared their dreams and struggles, and sought guidance, believing they were talking to a trustworthy, well-meaning adult. Now, those same teens had to come to terms with the unsettling truth that the person they had considered a mentor was, in fact, a dangerous criminal. One young man, who had often visited him to seek advice about his personal life, summed up the feeling of betrayal. "He made me feel like I could trust him. I never thought for a second that he was running from the law." It was especially chilling to think about how easily he had blended into the fabric of the community. As more teens came forward, recounting stories of how they'd spent time with him, the community was forced to confront the unsettling truth. Uncle G had been living in plain sight, hiding in the open. He had not only evaded the authorities for 3 decades, but had also built a network of relationships that helped him stay under the radar. The disturbing irony of it all was that, while he was supposedly helping the kids learn how to survive in the woods, he had been a master at surviving his own criminal past, using the guise of an innocent, harmless figure to avoid suspicion. The layers of deception that had allowed him to slip through the cracks for so long now became evident in the eyes of those he had once fooled. This revelation left the community shaken, with many questioning how someone could go unnoticed for so long, despite the numerous interactions he had with local residents. As they struggled to come to terms with the betrayal, some parents expressed deep regret for having allowed their children to spend so much time in the presence of someone with such a dark past. The local school district even held a meeting to address the impact on the students who had been close to him, offering counseling to help them process the shock and confusion. For the teens involved, it was a hard lesson in trust and deception, one they would carry with them for the rest of their lives. The community, once a safe haven, had been unknowingly harboring a dangerous fugitive, and the consequences of that revelation would be felt for years to come. As George was escorted to the waiting police car, his hands handcuffed behind him, he couldn't resist offering one last smirk in Jim's direction. "You're pretty sharp for a reflector cop," George chuckled, his voice laced with a touch of defiance, as if the years on the run had somehow made him feel invincible, even in the face of his long-overdue capture. He seemed almost amused by the fact that a seemingly routine traffic stop had led to his downfall after 3 decades of evading justice. Jim, never one to back down from a challenge, didn't miss a beat. "And you're pretty bold for a guy who got caught by one," he quipped, his words sharp but laced with a sense of satisfaction. His usual duties of ensuring bike safety had just evolved into something much more significant. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on him. He had started his day as the town's safety enforcer, but by evening, he had become a key player in cracking one of the most notorious cold cases in the area's history. His dedication to ensuring cyclists were properly equipped had inadvertently led him to discover a fugitive hiding in plain sight. As George was driven away, Jim stood there, reflecting on the unexpected twist of fate. The community had been living under the radar of a dangerous criminal for years, unknowingly passing him by, assuming he was just another local oddball. But now, everything had changed. The investigation into George's past was just beginning, and authorities were diving deep into the cold case files to piece together the true scope of his crimes. The charges from 1983 were chilling: kidnapping, assault, and a trail of broken lives stretching back over 40 years. Despite George's confident grin, there was no denying the gravity of the situation. The case was still pending, with many details yet to be fully revealed. But one thing was undeniable: the story of how Jim Barnes, the seemingly unremarkable bike safety officer, had uncovered the identity of one of the most wanted fugitives in the region, would soon be immortalized in local legend. For years to come, people would joke about the day bike safety enforcement became the town's newest crime-fighting tool. Jim would no longer just be known as the officer who made sure everyone had their reflectors and lights. No, Jim Barnes would be the hero who took down a fugitive and, in the process, transformed an everyday traffic stop into a tale that would be recounted at barbecues, local gatherings, and school assemblies. Every time someone on a bike got pulled over for not having a reflector, they'd smile knowingly and remember the day when Jim's sharp, "I saved the day," and possibly countless others. Jim wasn't in it for the fame, but as the weeks passed and the story of George's capture spread, it became clear that this was no ordinary case. It was a reminder that sometimes the most unexpected heroes come from the most unassuming places. And as for the legal outcome, while George's extradition to Wisconsin was the first step toward answering for his past, the road ahead was still long. But Jim knew one thing for sure: no one in Cedar Rapids would ever look at a cyclist without a reflector the same way again. The case of George Hartle Rowe is not just a story of punishment for a criminal who had been on the run for 3 decades, but also a profound lesson in attention and responsibility in one's work. Jim Barnes, a police officer who may only be known for tasks like bike safety enforcement, inadvertently became a hero in a complex criminal pursuit. This story reminds us that sometimes, even the smallest actions, such as ensuring traffic safety compliance, can lead to unexpected outcomes. The lesson here is to never underestimate your role, whether it's a daily task or something that seems unimportant. Every action can make a significant difference. We never know when we might become part of a larger story, but if we work with patience and responsibility, the end result may exceed our expectations. At the same time, the story affirms that justice always finds its way, no matter how elusive the criminal may be. Jim Barnes may have been just an ordinary cop, but in that moment, he became a guide for justice, helping to bring the long-forgotten darkness of a criminal to light. Therefore, never underestimate the importance of what you do, and always remember that sometimes, a small action can change a life.